Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to wrap up week 72 with Silmarillion Saturday. Now, these Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, whether from the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or more. Now, last week, we continued of the Rings of Power and the Third Age as the Rings of Power were crafted, and Celebrimbor was deceived. Today, we look at the rings for men and dwarves. From that time, war never ceased between Sauron and the elves, and Eregion was laid waste, and Celebrimbor slain, and the doors of Moria were shut. In that time, the stronghold and refuge of Imladris, that men called Rivendell, was founded by Elrond Half-Elven, and long it endured. But Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them out to the other peoples of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarves, but to men he gave 9, for men proved in this matter, as in others, the readiest to his will. And all those rings that he governed, he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. The dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They used their rings only for the getting of wealth. But wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hoards of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring. But all those hoards long ago were plundered, and the dragons devoured them. And of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. Men proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk, if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. And one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and under the domination of the one, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. The Nazgul were they, the ring-wraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. Now Sauron's lust and pride increased until he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things in Middle-earth, and to destroy the elves, and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Númenor. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. A mask he still could wear, so that if he wished, he might deceive the eyes of men, seeming to them wise and fair. But he ruled rather by force and fear, if they might avail. And those who perceived his shadow spreading over the world called him the Dark Lord, and named him the Enemy. And he gathered again under his government all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on earth or beneath it, and the orcs were at his command and multiplied like flies. Thus the black years began, which the elves call the days of flight. In that time many of the elves of Middle-earth fled to Lindon, and thence over the seas never to return. And many were destroyed by Sauron and his servants. But in Lindon Gil-galad still maintained his power, and Sauron dared not as yet to pass the mountains of Ered Luin, nor to assail the havens, and Gil-galad was aided by the Númenorians. Elsewhere Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastnesses of wood and mountain, and ever fear pursued them. In the east and south Well nigh all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in those days, and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war, and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. Yet there came at length a stay in the onslaught of Sauron upon the Westlands, for as is told in the Akallabeth, he was challenged by the might of Númenor. So great was the power and splendor of the Númenorians in the noontide of their realm that the servants of Sauron would not withstand them, and, hoping to accomplish by cunning what he could not achieve by force, he left Middle-earth for a while and went to Númenor as a hostage of Tar-Calion the king. And there he abode, until at the last by his craft he had corrupted the hearts of most of that people, and set them at war with the Valar, and so compassed their ruin, as he had long desired. But that ruin was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the West in their anger. The world was broken, and the land was swallowed up, and the seas rose over it, and Sauron himself went down into the abyss. But his spirit arose, and fled back on a dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home. There he found that the power of Gil-galad had grown great in the years of his absence, and it was spread now over wide regions of the north and west, and had passed beyond the misty mountains and the great river, even to the borders of Greenwood the Great, and was drawing nigh to the strong places where once he had dwelt secure. Then Sauron withdrew to his fortress in the Black Land, and meditated war. Man, there's a lot there. And we start with Sauron's ring distribution network, 7 to the dwarves. But remember, these rings were not made for the dwarves. Now, of course, if we go by the "it is said" bit, then each of the 7 clans of the dwarves got a ring. And that's interesting, because with the elves, the different elf clans didn't get one each. 2 rings for the Noldor, Gil-galad and Galadriel, and 1 ring for the Teleri, Círdan, though he gives his away anyway. But those rings can't really do much to the dwarves, those 7, that is. Sauron isn't able to use them to bring them under his sway, and that fits with what we read about the creation of the dwarves by Aule. No, it's the 9 given to men that proved to bear the most effective fruit for Sauron. All given to men who held power. We learned that 3 were given to great lords of Númenorian race, and the others were likely lords, chieftains, or other leaders who had some power but craved more, and they became his most terrible servants, bound so long as their rings existed, which Sauron eventually would be keeping in Barad-dûr. Now, I could spend another episode or 4 talking about his time in Númenor, but fortunately, we just spent several weeks on the Akallabeth, so there's absolutely no need to repeat that. So, folks, that does it for this week's Silmarillion Saturday. Thank you for joining me, and please come back next week as we continue Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age with a look at the Númenorian kingdoms in exile, Arnor and Gondor. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can get an ad-free feed, bonus episodes, and be a part of my content council to help decide what I'm going to talk about next series. If you're watching this on YouTube, the handle is now at Prancing Pony Pod. That's because we're bringing on all the content. The PPP, the Rings of Power wrap-up, the TTT, and PPP Plays will be here in one place for you to enjoy. Now, of course, the PPP Plays is currently running Tuesdays and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific, but subscribe so that you can be kept up to date with any changes. Consolidation is also the name of the game on social media. Please make sure you're following at Prancing Pony Pod on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok, and simply the Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook in order to get all of the Prancing Pony Podcast productions. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.